was after midnight. It was dark, and William Donovan was unfamiliar with Brighton and Glenelg as it was in 1909, with large estates and farmland broken by occasional clusters of cottages near Brighton Road. He knew Glenelg lay to the north, and once he found the seaside township, he would find assistance. So he drove the horse cab in that direction, and eventually found his way to Moseley Square and the police station. Strangely, the Brighton police station was only a few minutes away, on the corner of Beach Road. The cabman roused Constable Riley at about 2 a.m. on the 16th of September 1909 and informed him of what had happened. Another cab driver had been shot on the esplanade at Brighton. The constable phoned through to Brighton and alerted Mounted Constable Matthews, and then informed the City Watch House before calling on the services of Dr. O'Leary. Riley and Constable Fitzgerald picked up the doctor from his residence at Broadway, New Glenelg, and then they made the 2-mile trip south. Upon arrival, Dr. O'Leary examined a man lying on a stretcher in the house occupied by John Williams Howard Dennis. The man, Donald McLean, had severe gunshot wounds to the stomach, and although the doctor attempted to treat the man, he died from the injuries. Dr. O'Leary checked his watch. It was 7 minutes to 4 a.m. Before he died, McLean was able to make a statement to police, although he had been unable to say much after the arrival of the doctor. He gave his name to Constable Riley, who had asked what was the matter when he entered the room, and McLean looked at Dennis, who was holding a lantern over the bed, and said, "That's the man who shot me." The tragedy had begun in Adelaide, late the night before. Donald Sinclair Homer McLean was 33 years old. He lived with his father, wife of 3 years, Sarah Jane, and 2-year-old son Gordon, at Agnes Street, Eastwood. Like his father and his brother, he had been a cab driver for about 10 years. Previous to that he had been a jockey, apprenticed to John Hill, a trainer at St. Leonard's. He hadn't ridden since about 1905. McLean had been waiting for a fare. His mate William Donovan had met him at the Gresham Hotel between 8 and 9 that evening, and was seated beside him near the railway station on North Terrace, when John Dennis had hailed the cab by whistling at about 11:30 p.m. John Dennis was born at Mount Duneed, just south of Geelong, Victoria, in 1871. He was the manager of Bungaree Station, a position he had held for 6 years. Bungaree was a large sheep farm north of Clare, South Australia, established by the Hawker brothers in 1841, and covered 80,000 acres, having at one time a flock of 100,000 merino sheep. The station had its own store, school, blacksmith and church. Dennis, as manager, would have had about 50 staff and their families living on site to administer. He was popular in the area. Bungaree Station is still owned by the Hawker family and offers accommodation for tourists as well as retaining pastoral interests. Dennis was well known among the pastoral industry and was down from the country to inspect stock at the Royal Agricultural Show. Dennis was described as about 5'10", with broad shoulders and of an athletic build with ruddy cheeks. On this night, Dennis had been at the Commercial Travellers Club on the corner of Bank Street. It was evident that he had been drinking, but Donovan said he was still sensible as he entered the cab, Donovan stepping out so that Dennis could sit in the middle of the seat, between the two cabmen. Dennis gave them an address at the Esplanade, Brighton, where he, his wife and 2 young children, Neil aged 8 and John aged 4, were staying, several miles distant from Adelaide. One of the men asked, "Will we have a drink before this long drive?" Dennis had replied yes, as long as they didn't go out of the way. McLean drove them to a hotel in the city, and he and Dennis went in, Dennis shouting the cabmen a whisky each. Donovan stood outside holding the horses and went in for his drink when the other 2 came back out. As they made the hour-and-a-half-long journey to Brighton, the conversation at first revolved around horses. McLean remarked that he had been the man who had caught a racehorse called Trafalgar, who had run free on the Bay Road, now called Anzac Highway, the main thoroughfare from Adelaide to Glenelg, and had been rewarded with 1 shilling and 3 cigarettes for saving the horse's life. The two men, Dennis and McLean, appear to have started trying to outdo each other. Dennis remarked that he could drive horses, but McLean said he could do it better because he had been a jockey. Dennis dared the cab driver to let him try, and drove the cab for a while. Then they began talking about shooting pigeons. Dennis said he knew a man who was a good shot, but McLean said he would find someone better, and talk was made about betting £1 for each pigeon. McLean and Dennis shook hands on it. Dennis tried to shake hands with Donovan, but he refused to shake. Dennis stated, "I admire your style for not shaking hands with everybody." According to Donovan, when the cab arrived at the address given, Dennis alighted and went into the house without saying anything. He returned outside shortly after, bearing a breech-loading rifle. He removed 2 cartridges, which he showed to Donovan. Then addressing McLean, he said, "I want you to go down on your knees." McLean replied he was frightened of no gun. Dennis, standing 3 feet away, insisted, "Well, you go down on your knees." McLean replied, "I will not." "I'll make you bow to that rifle," said Dennis. As he finished saying so, there was a discharge, and McLean fell to the ground. Donovan spoke to McLean, startled and disbelieving what had just happened. "What are you funning at?" Dennis interjected. "Isn't he funny?" before heading back inside the house. McLean said, "Tip, I'm shot." Donovan still thought his friend was pretending, and said, "No, you're not." McLean insisted he was as Donovan picked him up. "Look there," he said, pointing to his side. "Go for the doctor." By this time Dennis had re-emerged with 2 glasses of whisky, which he handed to Donovan, telling him to give McLean one. Donovan drank his, but McLean refused the drink, and Donovan tossed it away. It was at this point that Donovan left to fetch the police. McLean had been unable to stand unaided, and was lying on the road as Donovan drove away. In his confusion and unfamiliarity with the area, Donovan got lost, directing the party back to the house. At one point, the constables began to doubt his story altogether. In all, it took 1 hour and 20 minutes for them to make it to the property. Dr. O'Leary had been with them, but they were met by Dennis's sister driving a vehicle. She took O'Leary and went on ahead. Dr. O'Leary made a post-mortem examination. There was a blackened wound 1.5 inches in diameter on the lower side of the abdomen. He estimated the gun was only a foot away from McLean when he was shot. Inside the abdominal cavity he found shot and gun wad. McLean's organs were healthy otherwise, and the gunshot was declared the sole cause of death. The inquest into the death was held at the Pier Hotel Glenelg on the 17th of September. Crowds of curious locals thronged the railway station to observe the arrival of the coroner, Dr. Ramsay Smith. The hotel had been chosen as the venue due to the limited space available in the police station. As soon as the doors opened, the crowd piled in and were jammed in like sardines, blocking the doorways. The witnesses gave evidence as to what had transpired. The coroner then asked Dennis's lawyer, Mr. Piper, if he intended to tender evidence in reply to what had been put forward. Piper replied that Dennis wanted to give evidence, but that he advised him legally that it was inadvisable. Dennis spoke up to say he wanted to give evidence. Piper was personally pleased that his client should, but again advised him not to. The coroner gave them time to confer, after which Dennis gave evidence. Dennis agreed with the events as related by Donovan, up until the time they reached Brighton. He said that McLean had spoken knowledgeably about guns and pigeon shooting, and he believed he would be interested in seeing a new gun Dennis had been given as a present 6 months earlier, and which he was very proud to own. He had got the gun out of its case, checked it was unloaded, and went outside. He had 3 or 4 cartridges in his pocket. He showed the gun and how it worked to the men. He said Donovan didn't seem to know much about guns, but that he handled it nevertheless. Then McLean took hold and examined the weapon before handing it back. He did not say whether he had advised the two men that the gun needed only a very light touch on the trigger. Dennis said he demonstrated loading the gun and closed the breech. He then intended to raise the gun to his shoulder and fire into the air when McLean grabbed for it, pulling it down and causing it to go off. Dennis asserted that he exclaimed, "Good God, have I hurt him?" Donovan replied, "No, he's only shamming." In Dennis's version of the events, Donovan asked for the whiskies and was adamant that McLean was faking, as he had not cried out in agony, despite repeating that he was shot. Despite this, Dennis was fearful he had injured the man. When Donovan left, Dennis's wife Eliza came and took the gun from her husband and brought out a lantern. By the light of the lantern, the couple could see that McLean was badly hurt, and so they got him inside and laid him on the bed. They tried to do what they could to alleviate his suffering. As Donovan was taking so long in returning, Dennis hitched his own ponies to his vehicle, and his sister-in-law drove off to get help, encountering and giving a ride to Dr. O'Leary. At one point, Dennis claimed he reloaded the gun and went into the garden contemplating suicide, but thought better of it and returned to McLean's side. He said there had been no argument or bickering. He denied telling McLean to kneel or that he would make him bow to the gun. Dennis agreed that he had been drinking that night, but that he was not drunk. Donovan, on the other hand, he said was very tight, but this had nothing to do with the gun going off. It was an accident. He denied that he had not replied when Constable Riley asked his name. Dennis claims he said he told the policeman it had been a frightful accident. Riley and Fitzgerald both denied any such claim had been made. There were several guns in the house, but the weapon which had been fired was outside in the garden. The police took possession of this. When Dr. O'Leary announced that McLean was dead, Constable Riley placed Dennis under arrest and cautioned him, informing Dennis he was to have to accompany them to the station. 2 cartridges were found in his pocket when he was searched. He asked to speak to his wife and told her that they were going to take him away. She replied that he had better go then. The police took Dennis and Donovan to the Brighton police station. Dennis was held in custody until the next day, when the inquest began. In summing up, the coroner said 2 questions needed to be settled. The first, cause of death, was simple: gunshot. The second question, who, was also straightforward. John Dennis had fired the shot, but was this murder, manslaughter, culpable negligence, accident, or justifiable homicide? Had Dennis not given evidence, he would have committed him for trial for manslaughter, but after his evidence he dismissed all except negligence and accident. The coroner remarked that men, while intoxicated in the middle of the night, would do things they would not do sober in the light of day. Dennis's intention to fire a gun at about 2 a.m. was an extraordinary one, but less extraordinary than him having intentionally shot McLean without reason. He delivered a verdict of accidental death, and John Dennis was free to go. But that was not the end of the matter. 4 days later, Thomas Smeaton, Labour MP for the electorate of Torrens, asked a question in Parliament regarding the case. Smeaton was a teetotaler and temperance advocate, who asked the Attorney-General if there was any process of law by which a man who kills another by the drunkenly careless use of firearms can be penalised by imprisonment, and the obligation put upon him to maintain those who are dependent upon the person he killed. Another Labour politician and future Premier of South Australia, Crawford Vaughan, followed with a question as to why the coroner had decided to conduct the inquest without a jury. He was entitled to do this, but could have been directed by the Attorney-General to have a jury. Vaughan queried whether the Attorney-General considered this matter sufficiently important to have given such direction. A third Labour member asked if a police report had been received and whether it would be tabled in Parliament. Letters were being written to the newspapers, condemning both the haste with which the inquest was finalised and the lack of juries since an amendment to the Coroner's Act had been made. One of the letters was written in the name of the wife of Crawford Vaughan. In all likelihood, most or all of the letters originated with the Labour Party. With such political pressure on the government, John Dennis was due to be sacrificed. On Tuesday, the 12th of October 1909, a warrant was issued for his arrest. He was taken into custody at Bungaree Station the same day and arrived in Adelaide late Wednesday. The Adelaide Police Court was crowded the next morning, but the matter adjourned within minutes until the next day. On Friday, the 15th of October, John Dennis was committed to trial in the Supreme Court on a charge of wilful murder. He was bailed on the following day. John Dennis's trial for having feloniously, wilfully, and of malice aforethought murdering Donald MacLean before Mr. Justice Homburg began at 10 a.m. on the 13th of December 1909 in a crowded courtroom. Mr. Piper appeared for Dennis. After Dennis had pleaded not guilty to the charge, the judge inquired of the Crown Solicitor why Dennis had been described as a labourer and not a station manager. The Crown Solicitor, Dashwood, replied it was the practice of the court. The judge thought it gave a false impression to the jury about a person, but Dashwood replied, "We are all labourers," and the matter was left. The first witness called was Donald MacLean, father of the deceased. He provided details about the health of his son prior to the shooting. He then revealed that Dennis had spoken kindly to him, the widow, and other relatives after the inquest. Dennis said he would do what he could for MacLean's widow and child, although he was not a rich man. He had paid the funeral expenses and made provision for Sarah and her child since. Sarah MacLean was satisfied with the atonement made by Dennis and believed he was doing the best he could. Dr. O'Leary appeared and stated that death was due to hemorrhage and shock from a gunshot wound. He said that when he arrived at the house, everything that could be done to assist MacLean had been done. He believed that Dennis was not drunk enough to be unaccountable for his actions. William Donovan recounted the details of the night as he remembered them. He again asserted that Dennis had told MacLean he would bow to his gun. Donovan denied that he had drunk a whisky in the city before the drive to Brighton, perhaps to suggest that he was not himself drunk at the time of the shooting. Mr. Piper asked Donovan, when he demonstrated how the gun was held at the committal hearing in October, why he had pointed it at Dennis. Donovan's reply was strange, to say the least. "That's what you've got to find out. I decline to tell you." "But you pointed it at Dennis in the police court. Why?" Piper continued to ask. "No, I don't know. You've got to find that out," Donovan repeated. The judge cautioned Donovan to try to answer as well as he could. Mr. Piper then asked a crucial question. "Could you show how the gun was held by Dennis when the shot was fired?" Donovan's answer was, "I could not be positive." "May I take it you were not watching the gun or Dennis?" asked Piper. "I didn't think for a moment he was going to shoot," Donovan admitted. Constable Riley reported on what had occurred after the police had arrived. Despite Mr. Piper's objections, the judge allowed Riley to tell the court what MacLean had said shortly before he died. "That is the man who shot me." Riley went on to claim that Dennis had threatened the police at the Brighton station, adopting a pugilistic pose and saying he would fight the two constables if they did not let him go in 10 minutes, and there would be trouble. Constable Fitzgerald said that he had heard Dennis say, "I would give my life twice over rather than this should happen." Finally, it was the turn of Dennis to make a statement from the dock. He said that it was MacLean who suggested a drink before they left the city. He denied that he himself was drunk. He said that because of their talk about shooting birds, he was showing his gun to MacLean. He denied telling MacLean to get on his knees and said there was no argument. He denied MacLean said he wasn't afraid of the gun. The only disagreement was MacLean saying that the gun was no good and Dennis saying it was. Dennis repeated his claim that as he was raising the gun to take a shot in the air, MacLean suddenly touched it as Dennis's finger was on the trigger and it went off accidentally. He finished by stating, "I felt McLean's death very much and have done all I can to help his wife and child." The judge, in summing up, said the jury had three alternatives to consider. If Dennis had been trying to force McLean to his knees with the intention of shooting him, then it was murder. If he was trying to force McLean to his knees with no intention of shooting him, but the gun discharged through carelessness, it was manslaughter. If the gun was handled negligently, and McLean died accidentally, then Dennis was not guilty. The jury deliberated for 45 minutes, and returned to say that they had found the accused guilty, not of murder nor of manslaughter, but of the careless use of firearms. Mr. Piper seized on that claim to say it was tantamount to a not guilty verdict. The judge, however, provided more direction, saying if the gun was intentionally pointed at McLean and went off through carelessness, it was manslaughter, and instructed the jury to return to their room and pursue further discussion. They returned to say they believed there was no criminal intent. Dashwood said there was not a question of criminal intent, but the careless use of firearms. Again, the judge directed them to consider if the gun was accidentally pointed at Dennis and accidentally discharged. If so, Dennis should be found not guilty. They returned after 15 minutes, seemingly reluctant to find Dennis guilty. This time the foreman announced, "Guilty of the careless use of firearms, which we take it amounts to manslaughter, with a recommendation to mercy." Again, Piper remarked that the jury's finding meant an acquittal. Justice Homburg recorded a finding of manslaughter, and said he would need to refer the matter to the full court for legal opinion on whether the jury's finding amounted to a verdict of guilty. The trial ended at 7:30 p.m. Dennis is said to have appeared calm throughout the day. As it happened, the question never went to the full court. John Dennis himself averted that. Piper spoke to the judge and said that his client wanted the matter settled to end the anxiety he and his wife had been living under, and was prepared to submit to the verdict of manslaughter. Piper reminded the judge that Dennis had always been of good character, and that his employers desired he return to Bungaree Station. The judge, speaking to Dennis, said the finding of the jury was exceptional, and that he agreed with their hesitancy to find criminal intent. This, along with his good character, the care he had shown to McLean after the shooting, and the financial help given to the family of McLean, justified him in discharging him, but that he could not do so without some qualification, and bound Dennis over for 12 months on 2 sureties of £100 each for future good conduct, and ordered him to pay the Crown's cost of prosecution, a sum of £35. Dennis maintained a low profile following the trial. He presumably returned to Victoria shortly after the events. On the 13th of July 1916, Dennis enlisted in the Australian Army in Melbourne and was assigned to the 23rd Battalion. He was 44 years and 9 months old when he enlisted, just short of the 45-year cut-off age for acceptance. Embarking on the troop ship Nestor on the 2nd of October 1916, he arrived at Plymouth, England on the 16th of November. He temporarily reached the rank of Lance Corporal, but was charged with drunkenness and absenting himself from roll call on the 21st November 1916, and reverted to the rank of private. After being treated for mumps, he was sent to France on the 4th of February 1917. On the 3rd of May, he was shot in the left thigh. His condition was considered so serious that the sister in charge penned a letter to his wife in Australia, reassuring her that everything was being done, and he may pull through, but that she deserved to know what had happened. He, however, survived the wound, though in great pain. He was in hospital at Rouen until the 18th of August 1917, when he was sent to Netley Hospital in England. He remained at the hospital until March of the next year, when he was moved to Harefield. He was sent to the No. 1 Australian Auxiliary Hospital. Dennis being admitted to Ward 35 on the 5th of March. Captain Mendelssohn of the Royal Australian Medical Corps checked on Dennis, who told him that his left thigh was fractured. Thinking he looked knocked up from his journey from France, he ordered a sedative for the patient. On the morning of the 6th, he again checked on Dennis to see if he was fit to leave on a hospital ship for Australia. Dennis said he did not feel like going to Australia at that moment. An orderly at the hospital, Sergeant Neems, spoke to Dennis on the 6th of March. He was quiet, but did not appear outwardly troubled. Sister Jackson, likewise, did not think he appeared unduly depressed during the day. At about 2 a.m, on the 7th of March, Sergeant Neems heard a noise and struck a match to check on Dennis, who was gasping. He had cut his own throat. A razor wrapped in some bandage to prevent the handle slipping lay beside him on the bed. Medical staff were alerted, but the wound was deep. He had cut right through his larynx, and nothing could be done to save the life of John Dennis. He was 46 years old when he died. An inquest found that he had taken his own life while temporarily of an unsound mind. At the request of his brother in Melbourne, it was announced that he had died of injuries. He was buried in St Mary's Churchyard, Harefield, Hillingdon, England, at 10:30 a.m. on the 11th of March 1918, in a joint service with Private Joseph Hogarth, who had died at the age of 40 from a pelvic tumour and peritonitis. About a dozen hospital staff were present. When probate was made on his will, it was found that John Dennis had left the sizable sum of £17,380 to his family, the equivalent of about 10 million Australian dollars in 2020. Eliza Dennis passed away in Victoria in 1952. Donald McLean's widow, Sarah Jane, remarried in 1921 and had a second son by her second husband. She died in May 1966. Donald's son Gordon became a telephone technician and died at the age of 81 in 1988.